And people stood up there and said, listen, my generation, we grew up with Stalin's name. And my best friends, they went to their deaths in the Nazi camps with Stalin's name on their lips. And now you're telling me, well, no, I'm not going to apologize. I'm not ashamed. I mean, I can also say that just as recently as 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, the Russian Communist Party, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, officially declared that Khrushchev's secret speech was erroneous, and based on historical prejudice, and they are trying officially now and formally to rehabilitate Stalin. And this is happening in Russia, where arguably, they bear the most responsibility for Stalin, but also they were at the center of the people who were victimized by Stalin. So there's a sadomasochistic element to this.
Okay, sorry, but we do back to Stalinism. We have to talk about the purges because this must be one of the most grotesque chapters in 20th century history, and I'm still struggling to understand why people, and especially people in Stalin's inner circle, fellow communists, basically just sat around twiddling their thumbs, waiting for their turn, even though they knew fully well, like you said, there might be a knock at the door and they're going to be up next. They're usually along with their families. I mean, how did that work?
It really is that heart of darkness at the very essence of the Stalinist experience that many, many historians have torn their hair out trying to understand how people were broken in such a way. And there are, history is always both overdetermined and underdetermined. I mean, in individual cases, you could see certain factors working. They used torture. They used terror. They used essentially holding threats against somebody's family against them. You can get people to confess to a lot if you torture them, if you threaten to torture their children. In that sense, it's not such a mystery. But the other thing is that these die-hard Bolsheviks, part of it was a sense of, if this is what the party needs from me to take the blame for X or Y, I am prepared to do whatever the party needs for me. That played a role. These people who absolutely had devoted their lives to this project. And the sense that if it has all gone wrong, if this was all some kind of a grotesque mistake, if we have really led humanity not to liberation, but to terror, then how can I go on living at all? Then what is the point? Then I've given my life for something truly evil. I mean, this
So
is
it's
what
best
you
that
see.
I carry on instead of potentially uncovering that we've all made like a colossal mistake.
Yeah, or that I allow myself to be sacrificed, or that there were quite a lot of suicides as well. But this is what you see in like Arthur Kessler's Darkness at Noon. There's
I
a
haven't read
very
it.
good,
I have it on my to-read list, yeah. It's about
and
show trials, right?
that's the classic account. I mean, it's really based above all on the Bukharin trial in Moscow. And Bukharin's confession at the end, in which he's embracing his own guilt and he's embracing the fact that he's about to be executed. Uh, Another story I can tell you is that when the Rudolf Slansky and his co-conspirators, all of these high-ranking communists, 14 of them, were put on trial in Prague in 1952. Otto Katz gets up there and gives a closing speech that is taken almost verbatim from Kessler's Darkness at Noon. And Kessler took it from Bukharin's confession in the 1930s. So it was too fantastic to be believed, in Moscow in the 1930s. Kessler exposes it in the meantime in this novel that millions of people read. Otto Katz spits it back out in Prague in 1952, and they buy it and they hang him. And it's an extraordinary story. In fact, the French director Ruth Silberman recently, a few years ago, 2022, 2021, made a documentary film about the Slansky trial using very newly discovered footage from the trial. And it's fantastically good. It's definitely worth seeing, and trying to figure out, how did these people confess? How do you get these people to confess? And how do you get a whole population to believe in it? At the time of the Slansky trial, all of the newspapers splattered across the front page, death to the fascists, death to the imperialist, the workers demand death, death, death. It's this orgy of bloodlust.
By the way, if we backtrack just a little bit, because I'm not too familiar with Bukharin's case, how did one, perhaps, if we stay with him, how did one fell out of favor with the regime?
Very easily, because it was largely arbitrary. And that's it.
So it didn't take much. You didn't have to pelt Stalin with eggs to be denounced and then arrested.
No, by the height of the terror, you didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to make a critical remark. But one of the things one of the characteristics is that because anyone could denounce anyone at any time, everyone was both infinitely powerful and infinitely vulnerable. You want the apartment of the person next door? Well, you might mention that you thought that person was rolling his eyes when there was a mention of Stalin. But somebody could do the same thing to you. And so that spirals. There's also this sense of contagion. Somebody gets arrested, and then anyone who has any association with them gets arrested. There's, one of the things I'm going to make students read this year is some passages from Nadezhda Mandelstam's extraordinary memoir, which is a book everybody should read, Hope Against Hope. And she talks about their protocols when Osip Mandelstam, her husband, gets arrested, and Anna Hakhmatova's son comes over that morning, and she says immediately, Osip got arrested, go away. She said, we have a protocol. When somebody gets arrested, everybody immediately goes as far away as possible because any kind of contact can be a contagion. And because of this contagiousness, everything spreads. There was no safe space of any line to stand on, which I think was different in Nazi Germany. I think you did have a choice. I think to be on a good side of Hitler, to know what you had to do and what you had to say. And that was just not true in the Stalinist terror. There was absolutely no safe space. And Molotov, they purge his wife, and he remains loyal.
Yeah, I remember that. But then it was completely arbitrary. How did you get selected, so to speak, by this rotisserie of death? I mean, probably wasn't a good idea to be close to Stalin. That much is certain, right?
Yeah, certainly the party was turning against itself. I think it was more dangerous in the cities. But then there was also a huge amount of arbitrariness involved.
Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, follow and rate on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, marketing tutorials. Insist, it's really important that I hassle you about that, so I'm doing it. Also, if you'd like to, please support me on Patreon. This is a one-person podcast. I know I say this every time, but I do everything by my little old self. There's no team behind me. It's very, very sad, I know. But you can help by hopping on Patreon and finding the Smart Cookies podcast on there. And then last, but certainly not least, I have to thank my existing patrons. Tovarish Intovarishitsa, without you, there would be no Smart Cookies, which makes you the real actual producers of this show. So eternal thanks to Matija Renčel, Dumi Holdis, Andraš Rakušček, Florian Hauer, Peter Karba, Matija Zopančič, Dejan Žulnir, Darej, Rok Tržan, Saša Vipotnik, Neven Cvijanović, Jušpremrov, Nate Sir, Goran Ivašić, Anže Sever, Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaš Mahar, Štrole, Ajda, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordon Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Taichi. Thank you so much. Your support means the world to me.